My son hit me in my own kitchen, and I didn't raise my voice. I didn't curse. I didn't threaten him. I didn't even ask why. I stayed where I was on the cold tile floor, tasting blood, listening to his footsteps fade up the stairs. And I let him believe exactly what he wanted to believe, that I had finally learned my place. The next morning, he came downstairs smiling. He thought my silence meant surrender. He thought the table I set was an apology. He thought the smell of coffee and food meant the old rules still applied, that fathers endured, sons ruled, and violence disappeared if no one spoke its name. He was wrong. Because silence can be many things. Fear is one of them. Shame is another. But sometimes silence is a decision sharp and deliberate, made in the exact moment a man realizes that surviving another night means changing the shape of the morning. When my son walked into the kitchen that day, he thought he was arriving at victory. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that justice had already been invited. It was on its way. And it was going to sit down at the table with us. My name is Elias Ward. I was 60 years old when I learned that love without limits can become a slow kind of suicide. I lived in a quiet town in southern Georgia, the kind of place where people waved from their porches and measured time by church bells and high school football seasons. My house stood at the end of a tree-lined street, modest but well-kept, the same house my wife and I had moved into 35 years earlier when we thought life would unfold the way it was supposed to. My wife Margaret used to say, the house had good bones. She meant more than the walls. She meant the way we filled it with Sunday dinners, with laughter, with arguments that ended in apologies. She meant the kind of home where doors were left unlocked because nothing inside needed protecting. That changed after she died. Cancer doesn't arrive loudly. It comes in whispers and test results and long nights pretending you're asleep while the person you love stares at the ceiling beside you. Margaret fought for 3 years. When she lost, the house didn't break all at once. It hollowed out slowly, room by room, until the quiet became unbearable. Daniel moved back in a few months after the funeral. My son had always been the responsible one. College degree, steady job, polite, articulate, dependable. People at church used to tell me how lucky I was, how proud Margaret would have been of the man he'd become. And I believed them, because believing them meant believing I hadn't failed as a father. At first, his presence felt like mercy. He fixed things around the house. He cooked sometimes. He told me not to worry about bills. We were 2 men learning how to live without the woman who had anchored us both. Then his job fell apart. Then the drinking started. Then the rules changed. It didn't happen in one dramatic moment. Control never does. It arrives disguised as concern. Daniel began correcting me how I loaded the dishwasher when I turned off the lights, what I spent money on. He spoke louder when I questioned him, quieter when he wanted to punish me. The house adapted around his moods the way people adapt around bad weather. I learned which questions to avoid, which evenings to stay silent, which version of my son would walk through the door based on the sound of his car in the driveway. I told myself this was grief. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that fathers endure so sons can heal. The night he hit me, it was raining. He came home late, drunk enough that his words tangled together. He blamed me for things that made no sense, for his job, for his loneliness, for the way his life had narrowed into something bitter and small. I told him to go to bed. I told him we'd talk in the morning. That was when his hand came out of nowhere. I remember the sound more than the pain. A dull, shocking crack that didn't belong in a kitchen that had once held birthday cakes and family prayers. I fell hard. My head hit the cabinet. Something warm ran down my face. He stood over me, breathing, heavy eyes glassy with something darker than anger. Then he turned away, muttered something about respect, and went upstairs like he'd merely closed a door too hard. I lay there for a long time. When I finally got up, my hands were shaking. But my mind was clear in a way it hadn't been for months. I saw myself in the bathroom mirror, older, bruised, smaller than I remembered being. And for the first time, I didn't feel confusion. I felt certainty. I cleaned the blood from the floor. I rinsed my mouth. I wrapped ice in a towel and pressed it to my cheek. And then instead of going to bed, I started preparing breakfast. I cooked quietly, methodically, the way you do when you don't want your thoughts to wander into places that might break you open before you're ready. I set the table with care. I brewed fresh coffee. I straightened chairs that hadn't moved in years. As the night thinned into morning, I made 3 phone calls. I didn't leave messages. I spoke calmly. I asked for help without explaining everything. I didn't beg. I didn't dramatize. I simply told the truth. By the time the sun rose, my house looked the way it always had. Peaceful, orderly, safe. Daniel came downstairs, rubbing his temples, wearing that smug half-smile I'd learned to recognize. He glanced at my face, noticed the swelling, and looked away satisfied. "Well," he said, reaching for a cup, "looks like you finally learned." I said nothing. Silence, after all, can be an ending. Or it can be the sound a door makes just before something irreversible walks through it. By the time Daniel finished his coffee that morning, the house had already chosen sides. I watched him from across the table without staring, the way you observe an animal you once trusted, but now understand is unpredictable. He chewed loudly, crumbs falling onto the placemat Margaret had woven years ago, and talked as if nothing significant had happened, complaining about his headache, the rain, the neighbor's dog barking too early. He spoke with the casual authority of a man who believed the world would continue to bend around him. I nodded when a nod was expected. I refilled the coffee pot when it ran low. I kept my movements slow, careful, the way you do when you don't want to attract attention. Inside, I was measuring time. After breakfast, Daniel announced he was going back to bed. He said it like a declaration, like a king retreating to his chamber after issuing orders. Before leaving the kitchen, he paused and looked at me again. Next time, he said, tapping the table with his knuckle, "Don't push me." Then he turned and climbed the stairs, his footsteps heavy and unsteady. I stayed seated long after his door closed. The house settled around me the way it always did after he disappeared upstairs. The refrigerator hummed. The clock over the sink ticked forward 1 second at a time, indifferent to whatever had broken inside its walls. I pressed my fingers against my cheek and winced. The swelling was worse now. Purple bloomed beneath my skin like ink spreading in water. I should have been afraid. I should have been ashamed. Instead, I felt something colder and steadier take root. Margaret used to say that fear makes people loud. Certainty, she said, makes them quiet. I began cleaning, not the frantic kind of cleaning that comes from panic, but the slow, deliberate kind that gives your hands something to do while your mind finishes a decision. I washed dishes that were already clean. I wiped the counter twice. I swept the kitchen floor even though there was nothing on it but a few crumbs Daniel had dropped. Every small task felt like reclaiming territory. When I finished, I went to the living room and sat in the chair by the window, the one Margaret had loved because it caught the afternoon light just right. Outside, the street looked exactly as it always had. Mrs. Collins was trimming her hedges. A delivery truck passed. Somewhere down the block, a lawnmower started up. Normal life continued. I wondered how many men lived behind those doors, feeling the same quiet dread I had felt for months. How many fathers had convinced themselves that silence was strength, that endurance was love, that taking one more blow, verbal or otherwise, was just part of the job. I thought of my own father. He'd been a small man with a quiet voice and hands permanently rough from factory work. He believed in discipline and respect in keeping problems inside the family. He also believed that children learned what you allowed them to see. When I was 12, my older brother had shoved him during an argument. Just once. A flash of temper. An apology followed. Everyone pretended it had never happened. 2 years later, my brother shoved him again, harder. By the time I left for college, my father spoke less, moved less, seemed to shrink inside his own house. No one ever called it abuse. They called it stress. They called it a phase. He died quietly at 68. I hadn't thought about that in years. The memory didn't make me angry. It made me resolved. In the early afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Need cash, running low, don't make this difficult." I stared at the screen until it went dark. This was the rhythm we'd fallen into over the past year. Demand, compliance, silence, reset. Each time the line moved a little further. Each time I told myself I was preventing something worse. I didn't respond. An hour later, another message arrived. "You ignoring me now?" Still I said nothing. Silence had always been my weakness. That day, it became my leverage. As evening approached, I moved through the house, checking things I hadn't checked in months. Doors, windows. The lock on the back entrance that Daniel rarely used, but had never bothered to fix properly. I found the spare key he kept hidden in the garage and moved it to my pocket. I cooked a simple dinner soup and bread and ate alone at the kitchen table. The chair across from me remained empty. I didn't rush. I didn't choke down food out of nerves. I tasted what I ate. When the sky outside turned dark, I turned on every light in the house. Daniel didn't come down that night. From upstairs, I heard his television, the sound of laughter from a show he liked, the clink of a bottle being set down too hard. Each noise used to tighten something in my chest. That night, I let the sounds pass through me without reaction. I went to bed early. Sleep came in fragments. I woke at every creak, every imagined step on the stairs. My body hadn't caught up with my decision yet. Fear doesn't disappear just because you've named it. At 3 a.m, Daniel stumbled into the hallway, muttering to himself. He knocked over something, I couldn't tell what, and cursed loudly. My heart raced, but I stayed in bed, breathing slow, counting the seconds until his door closed again. When it did, I didn't feel relief. I felt confirmation. The next day followed the same pattern. Daniel slept late. He complained, he demanded. I complied where compliance cost me nothing, and withheld where it mattered. I didn't argue. I didn't challenge him. I observed. I noticed how quickly his mood shifted when he didn't get what he wanted. How small frustrations sent him spiraling. How often his anger circled back to me, no matter the cause. This wasn't grief anymore. This was entitlement sharpened by resentment. By the third day, the bruise on my face had darkened into something impossible to hide. Daniel noticed it in passing, frowned, and then shrugged as if it were furniture he'd grown bored of. "You should cover that," he said. "People will talk." I looked at him, then really looked, and realized something that had been forming quietly in my mind. He wasn't afraid of what he'd done. He was afraid of being seen. That evening, as I stood at the sink washing my plate, Daniel leaned against the doorway and watched me. His eyes were bloodshot, his posture loose and careless. "You're acting strange," he said. "Don't think this quiet thing is going to change anything." I turned off the faucet and dried my hands. "It already has," I said, my voice steady. He laughed a short, dismissive sound. "Sure it has." He went back upstairs, confident, untroubled. I returned to the living room and sat in Margaret's chair again, the fading light casting long shadows across the floor. I took out my phone and looked at the numbers I'd saved earlier in the week. I hadn't called them yet. Not all of them. Timing mattered. Justice, I was learning, wasn't about explosion. It was about alignment. That night, as the house settled into its uneasy quiet, I made a promise to myself that felt heavier than any vow I'd ever taken. I would not raise my voice. I would not beg. And I would not allow love to be used as a weapon against me ever again. The morning would come soon enough. And when it did, the table would be ready. The night everything finally tilted beyond repair began. The way so many of our nights had quiet tense, pretending to be ordinary. Daniel came home after midnight. I knew it was him before the headlights even cut across the living room wall. His engine always idled a half-second too long, as if he needed to gather himself before stepping into whatever mood waited inside the house. I stayed seated in the dark, the television off my hands, folded in my lap. The door opened hard. Shoes were kicked off without care. A bottle clinked against the hallway table. Still up, he called out, his voice already thick. I didn't answer. He appeared in the doorway, squinting, annoyed by the fact that I hadn't rushed to acknowledge him. He smelled of alcohol and something sour underneath it, a scent that had become so familiar it barely registered anymore. "What, you deaf now?" he snapped. "I was waiting for you to settle in," I said calmly. That word calmly was enough to set him off. He laughed, but it wasn't humor. It was disbelief sharpened into mockery. "You always waiting, huh? Waiting? Watching, judging. That's all you do." I stood up slowly. Not to confront him, to remove myself. Experience had taught me that movement mattered. Sudden gestures could turn irritation into something worse. "I'm going to bed," I said. "We can talk tomorrow." His face hardened. "There you go again," he said, stepping closer. "Always running, always acting like you're better than me." I didn't say that. "You don't have to." His voice rose. "You think I don't see it? That look you get when I walk in, like I'm some kind of disappointment." I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the instinct to explain, to reassure, to fix. I forced myself to stay still. "I'm tired, Daniel," I said. "That's all." The silence that followed was sharp. For a moment I thought he might let it go. He swayed slightly, rubbed his face, looked away. Then he stepped closer again, close enough that I could see the red veins in his eyes. "You know what he said quietly? You should be grateful I'm here." I didn't respond. This house would have swallowed you whole if I hadn't come back. Bills unpaid, repairs ignored. You'd be sitting here alone, rotting. I met his gaze. "I was alone before you moved back in. That was the wrong thing to say." His hands shot out, not striking, but grabbing my sleeve. Hard. His fingers dug into my arm. "Don't talk to me like that," he hissed. I froze. Not because I was helpless, but because I knew what escalation looked like. I knew that pulling away could be interpreted as defiance. "Let go," I said evenly. For a second, his grip tightened. Then he released me with a shove that sent me stumbling back into the chair. He stood there, breathing hard, staring at me like he'd surprised himself. Then his expression shifted, not to remorse, but to something like justification. "You push me," he said. "You know how to push me." He turned and headed for the stairs. I stayed seated long after his footsteps disappeared. My arm throbbed where his fingers had been. I rolled up my sleeve and saw the marks already forming red, now soon to bruise. Evidence I'd learned to hide without thinking. But something inside me didn't retreat the way it usually did. I went to the bathroom and studied my reflection. The man staring back looked older than his years, yes, but also clearer. As if the fog that had settled over my life had begun to lift, revealing the edges of things. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't grief. This was a pattern, and patterns don't break themselves. I slept lightly that night, my mind replaying moments I'd dismissed for too long. The time he'd slammed a door inches from my face. The way he'd blocked my path in the hallway during an argument, towering over me until I apologized just to escape. The nights I'd lain awake listening for his footsteps, calculating when it was safe to get a glass of water. I had told myself this was temporary. That once he found work again, once the pressure eased, things would go back to normal. Normal was gone. Morning came gray and damp. I made breakfast out of habit, not hunger. Daniel came down late wearing headphones, avoiding my eyes. He took food-left dishes in the sink and disappeared again. The bruise on my arm darkened as the day wore on. I didn't cover it. In the afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook Margaret had kept for grocery lists and phone numbers. I opened to a blank page and wrote a single word at the top. Boundaries. I stared at it for a long time. I'd spent my life believing boundaries were for other people, selfish people, people who didn't understand sacrifice. Margaret had been my balance, the one who reminded me that caring for others didn't require erasing yourself. Without her, I had slowly erased myself anyway. That evening, Daniel came home in a worse mood than the night before. He complained about money, about his friends, about how unfair life was. When I didn't immediately offer to help, his frustration sharpened. "You hearing me?" he snapped. "Yes." "Then say something." "What do you want me to say?" "That you get it," he said. "That you're on my side, Mule." I took a breath. "I can care about you without agreeing with everything you do." He stared at me as if I'd spoken a foreign language. "You're not my father anymore," he said suddenly. "You're just in my way." The words landed heavier than any shove. I didn't answer. I turned back to the stove, my hands steady despite the storm inside me. He laughed again, bitter. "That's what I thought." He went upstairs and slammed his door. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the living room with the lights off, listening to the house breathe around me. I thought of Margaret, of the promises I'd made to protect our family. I wondered what she would say if she could see us now. Just before dawn, I stood and walked through the house slowly, touching the walls, the door frames, the furniture we'd chosen together. This place was more than wood and paint. It was my life, and I was done shrinking inside it. I returned to the kitchen, sat at the table, and opened my phone. My thumb hovered over a number I hadn't dialed yet. A man I'd known for years. Someone who believed in order, in consequences, in doing the hard thing when the easy thing had failed. I didn't call him yet. Not until I was certain. Upstairs, Daniel slept heavily, unaware that the balance he relied on, the one built on my silence, was already collapsing. I looked down at the word in the notebook. Boundaries. Tomorrow, I decided, would be the day silence stopped being a shield and became a line. And once crossed, nothing would ever return to the way it was before. Morning arrived without ceremony. No dramatic light through the windows, no thunder, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the steady ticking of the clock above the sink marking time the way it always had, indifferent to whatever had shifted during the night. Daniel didn't come down until nearly 10. I was already dressed, already awake, already prepared. Not prepared in the way you prepare for a fight with clenched fists and raised voices, but in the way you prepare to tell the truth without flinching. My cheek was still swollen. The bruise had deepened into something dark and unmistakable. I had made no attempt to hide it. When he finally entered the kitchen, he stopped short. His eyes flicked to my face, then away, then back again. A brief tightening of his jaw betrayed irritation, not guilt. "What happened to you?" he asked, his tone flat. "You know," I said. He scoffed. "You should have iced it better. That was it. That was all." No apology, no hesitation. Just a mild annoyance, as if I'd failed to maintain the illusion properly. I poured myself coffee and sat at the table. Daniel opened the fridge, rummaged through it, loudly slammed the door shut. "You're being dramatic," he said. "People get hurt. It happens." I didn't answer. Silence has a strange effect on people who are used to control. Without resistance, their words hang in the air longer than they expect. They start to hear themselves. He sat across from me, tapping his fingers against the table. "You gonna talk or what? I'm listening." "That's not the same thing." "No," I agreed. "It isn't." He leaned back in his chair, studying me now, as if trying to locate the version of his father he'd grown accustomed to, the one who softened, who explained, who apologized, even when he hadn't done anything wrong. That man didn't show up. "You know," Daniel said slowly, "if you hadn't pushed me, none of this would have happened." There it was. The familiar logic. The rewriting of cause and effect. "I told you to go to bed," I said. "That was all." He laughed. "And that's your problem. You think you get to tell me what to do?" I took a sip of coffee. "I think I get to say no." The word landed heavier than I expected. Daniel's expression changed. Not anger yet, but something closer to confusion. He wasn't used to me naming things so plainly. No, he repeated. Yes. He stood up abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. You don't get to say no to me in my own house. I looked at him then fully, without lowering my eyes. This is my house, I said quietly. His nostrils flared. For a moment I thought he might step closer. My body tensed, not in fear, but in readiness. He didn't move. Instead, he smiled. A thin, humorless curve of his mouth. Careful, he said. You're starting to sound ungrateful. Ungrateful. The word echoed long after he left the room. That afternoon, I went for a walk. I hadn't walked that far in months, not beyond the mailbox, not beyond the corner. The street felt unfamiliar in a way it hadn't before, as if I'd been living inside a smaller world than I realized. Neighbors waved. I waved back. No one stared. No one asked questions. People see what they expect to see. I walked past the park where Daniel used to play as a boy, where I'd taught him to throw a baseball, where Margaret had sat on a bench clapping every time he ran toward us with that wild, breathless grin. For a moment, the memory nearly undid me. I sat down and let it pass. Love doesn't disappear just because it's been betrayed. It lingers. It complicates things. But it doesn't get to make the rules anymore. When I returned home, Daniel was gone. His car wasn't in the driveway. The house felt lighter without him in it, like a held breath finally released. I stood in the kitchen and made a decision. I would not wait for the next explosion. Waiting was what had brought me here. I picked up the phone and dialed the first number. The man on the other end answered on the second ring. His voice was steady, familiar. Elias, he said, everything all right? I replied, but it will be. There was a pause, not surprise, recognition. Do you want to tell me what's going on? Yes, I said, but not over the phone. Then come by, he said, or I can. Tomorrow morning, I said. Here. Another pause. Then I'll be there. I hung up and exhaled. The second call was harder. My sister lived 2 hours away. We spoke regularly, but I'd never told her everything. I'd protected the image of my son, even from her, the way parents often do, shielding the world from the truth, because admitting it feels like failure. She answered immediately. Eli, she said. What's wrong? I need you to listen, I said. And I need you not to interrupt. She didn't. When I finished, there was silence on the line, thick and heavy. I'm coming, she said finally. You don't have to. I do, she said. You should have called me sooner. I know. The third call I didn't make yet. Timing mattered. Daniel came home late that night, louder than usual. I stayed in my room, the door locked. When he tried the handle and found it unyielding, he cursed and pounded once hard enough to rattle the frame. Open the damn door, he shouted. I'm sleeping, I said through the wood. My voice didn't shake. Don't start this, he warned. I didn't respond. Eventually, he gave up. I lay awake long after the house fell quiet, my heart steady, my mind clear. Fear still lived in my body, but it no longer dictated my actions. The next morning, I woke early and began preparing breakfast. Not out of habit, out of intention. I cooked more than usual, set the table properly, used the dishes Margaret saved for special occasions, not because I was pretending everything was fine, but because I wanted the moment to be unmistakable. Daniel came down just after 8, bleary-eyed and smug. He took in the spread and smiled. Well, he said, look at that. Guess you finally figured it out. I said nothing. He sat down, poured himself coffee, took a bite of toast. Good, he said. This is how it should be. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. The doorbell rang. Sharp, clear, unavoidable. Daniel frowned. Who's that? I stood up. Someone I invited, I said. He laughed. Send them away. I walked past him without answering. As my hand closed around the doorknob, I felt no hesitation, no doubt, only the quiet certainty of a man who had finally stopped asking for permission to be safe. I opened the door, and the morning changed shape. The man on my porch didn't raise his voice or rush his steps. He didn't need to. He stood there with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime being listened to without asking for it. "Good morning, Elias," he said. "Good morning," I replied, stepping aside. "Thank you for coming." He nodded once, his eyes already moving past me, taking in the house. The hallway, the details people notice when they are trained to see patterns instead of surfaces. Behind him stood two others. One was a uniformed police officer I recognized from church events and town meetings, his posture relaxed, but alert, his presence unmistakable. The other was my sister, Ruth. Her coat still buttoned, her face set in that familiar expression that meant she had already decided whose side she was on. Daniel's voice carried from the kitchen, sharp with irritation. "Who is it?" I didn't answer. The retired judge stepped inside first. The officer followed. Ruth came last, her hand brushing my arm as she passed, grounding me in a way she always had. I closed the door behind them. The sound was soft, final. Daniel was standing when we entered the kitchen, his chair pushed back. His expression caught somewhere between annoyance and confusion. He took in the sight in stages, the stranger in a tailored jacket, the uniform, my sister. His smile faltered. "What's this?" he demanded. "What's going on?" No one answered immediately. The judge took a slow look around the room, then turned to me. "Is this the table you mentioned?" "Yes," I said. He nodded and pulled out a chair, not at the head, not opposite Daniel, but slightly to the side, a position that didn't challenge but didn't yield either. He sat down deliberately, folded his hands, and looked at my son. "Daniel Ward," he said calmly. "We need to talk." Daniel scoffed. "I don't know who you are, but this is a family matter." The officer stepped forward just enough to be seen. "It stopped being private when someone got hurt." Daniel's gaze snapped to him. "You serious right now?" I am, the officer replied. Ruth moved to stand beside me. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her presence spoke for years of loyalty, of shared childhood, of knowing me before I became smaller than myself. Daniel laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "This is ridiculous. Dad, tell them to leave." I looked at my son and felt something settle into place inside me. "No," I said. The word didn't tremble. It didn't need to. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Daniel, I'm here because your father asked me to be. I've known your family for a long time. I'm not here to accuse you of anything yet. I'm here to listen. And I suggest you do the same." "Yet," Daniel snapped. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," the officer said evenly, "that we're going to establish some facts." Daniel turned to me again, eyes flashing. "You called the cops on me. I asked for help." I said, "There's a difference." His jaw tightened. "You always do this. You exaggerate. You play the victim." The judge raised a hand, not sharply, just enough to stop the spiral. "Daniel, look at your father's face." Daniel hesitated, then glanced at me, really glanced. The bruise had darkened overnight, blooming in colors that told the truth without words. He looked away first. The officer took out a small notebook. "We received a report of an altercation at this address. I'm going to ask a few questions." Daniel shook his head. "This is insane. He fell. He's old." The words hit harder than any shove. I didn't respond. I let the silence do what it was designed to do. "Did you put your hands on your father last night?" the officer asked. Daniel hesitated. "Just long enough." "I didn't mean to," he said finally. "He provoked me." The judge leaned back in his chair. "Violence doesn't require intent to count, Daniel." "You don't know what he's like," Daniel shot back. "He pushes. He judges. Enough," I said. Everyone turned to me. "I'm done explaining myself," I continued. "I'm done softening the truth so it's easier to swallow." Ruth's hand tightened briefly on my arm. "I told you to go to bed," I said to Daniel. "You grabbed me. You shoved me." I hit the cabinet. That's what happened. Daniel opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. The officer nodded slowly. Thank you. Daniel's voice rose. So what? You going to arrest me over one mistake? The judge's expression hardened just a fraction. Patterns are built from one mistakes, Daniel, and your father isn't obligated to carry yours. Daniel turned to Ruth. You believe this? She met his gaze without hesitation. I believe my brother. The words landed with finality. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing now. This is unbelievable. After everything I've done for him, what you've taken doesn't count as help, I said quietly. He stopped moving. The judge spoke again. Daniel, here's what's going to happen. The officer is going to document this incident. Your father will decide how he wants to proceed. That decision will be respected. Daniel laughed again, but there was panic underneath it now. You think he's going to press charges? He wouldn't dare. I looked at him, then really looked, and felt the last thread snap. I'm not doing this to punish you, I said. I'm doing it to stop you. The officer stepped closer. Daniel, I need you to sit down. For a moment, I thought he might refuse. His shoulders were tense, his fists clenched. Then he sat. The judge folded his hands again. This isn't a courtroom, he said, but it is accountability, and it starts now. Daniel's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that wasn't there. What happens next? He asked, his voice smaller. I answered him. Next, I said, you face what you've been avoiding. The officer closed his notebook. Daniel Ward, I'm going to ask you to stand and place your hands where I can see them. Daniel looked at me, really looked, fear flickering across his face for the first time. You're really doing this, he whispered. I nodded. Yes, I said, I am. The house was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not fear, not surrender. It was the sound of a line being held. Daniel stood with his hands half raised, frozen between defiance and disbelief, as if his body hadn't decided which instinct would win. Dad, he said, trying my name like a key he hoped would still open something. You don't have to do this. The officer didn't touch him. He didn't rush. He simply waited, his presence steady, patient, the way consequences often are. I asked you to place your hands where I can see them, the officer said again, calm and even. Daniel looked around the kitchen at the table set so carefully, at the man seated beside it, who had not raised his voice once, at my sister, whose gaze never wavered, and finally back at me. I said nothing. Slowly he lowered himself into the chair. His hands dropped into his lap. The fight drained out of him all at once, leaving something small and brittle behind. This is unbelievable, he muttered. You really think this is going to fix anything? No, I said. I think it's going to stop it. The judge leaned forward slightly. Daniel, this isn't about fixing you. That's work only you can do. This is about safety and accountability. Daniel let out a short laugh. Accountability? You make it sound so clean. It can be, the judge replied. When people stop pretending. The officer took a step back, giving Daniel space, then addressed me. Mr. Ward, I need to be clear with you about your options. I nodded. You can choose to file a formal report today, he continued. That starts a legal process. Or you can choose not to, which doesn't erase what happened, but changes how it proceeds. Daniel snapped his head up. You see, you don't have to ruin my life over this. I met his eyes. I'm not ruining anything. The officer waited. He understood something Daniel didn't, that this decision had already been made long before words caught up to it. I want it documented, I said, and I want him out of my house. The words hung there heavy and irreversible. Daniel stared at me as if I'd spoken in a different language. You can't kick me out. I live here. You stay here because I allow it, I said. That ends today. Ruth inhaled sharply beside me, then exhaled, her shoulders relaxing as if she'd been holding her breath for months. The officer nodded. All right. Daniel, here's what's going to happen next. I'm going to step outside and call this in. We'll proceed from there. Daniel pushed his chair back abruptly. No. No, you don't get to just... The judge's voice cut in firm now. Sit down. Daniel stopped. I watched my son obey another man's authority without argument and felt no triumph in it, only sadness. Sadness for how far things had gone before anyone else could step in. While the officer stepped outside, the kitchen settled into an uneasy stillness. Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. You think you're better than me now? He said quietly. You think you've won? I don't think that at all, I replied. This isn't a competition. It feels like one. That's because you've been treating love like a power struggle, I said. And I let you. He looked up at me, then eyes, red voice, unsteady. You were supposed to be on my side. I was, I said. I am. But not at the cost of my safety. The judge stood. Daniel, I want you to hear something clearly. What your father is doing right now is not betrayal. It's intervention. Daniel scoffed weakly. From you? Yes, the judge said. From someone who has seen where this road leads. Silence stretched between us, thick with everything that could no longer be taken back. When the officer returned, his expression had shifted, not colder, just more official. Daniel Ward, he said, I'm placing you under temporary detention pending further steps. Daniel sprang to his feet. What? No, this is insane. The officer raised a hand. Turn around. Daniel looked at me, panic flaring. Dad, please, just tell him to stop. I didn't move. I didn't speak. The officer guided Daniel gently but firmly, securing his wrists. The sound of metal clicking closed was quiet but final, a sound that echoed in places deeper than the room. Daniel's shoulders sagged. You're going to regret this, he whispered, not with anger but fear. Maybe, I said, but I won't regret choosing to live. They led him toward the door. He resisted once weakly, then gave in. As he crossed the threshold, he turned back, his face a mixture of disbelief and grief. This house was my home, he said. It was mine first, I replied. And it will be again. The door closed behind them. The sound was soft. The quiet that followed was unlike any silence I had known before. It wasn't charged. It wasn't watchful. It was empty in a way that felt honest. My knees buckled without warning. Ruth caught my arm and guided me into the chair. You did the right thing, she said. I nodded, though the truth was heavier than right or wrong. It was simply done. The judge placed a hand on my shoulder. This part is never easy, he said, but it's necessary. I stared at the table, at the untouched coffee cooling in its cup, at the place where my son had sat just moments before. For the first time in years, the house felt like it belonged to me again. And for the first time, I allowed myself to breathe. He came down the stairs smiling, and that was how I knew he believed he had won. I remember the sound of his footsteps before I remember his face, slow, unhurried, confident. The kind of steps a man takes when he assumes the ground beneath him will always hold. Morning light spilled across the kitchen floor, catching the edges of the table I had set with more care than usual, and when Daniel entered the room, he paused just long enough to take it all in. The food, the coffee, the quiet. He smiled at me the way someone smiles at an apology they've successfully extracted. Well, he said, pulling out a chair. Look at that. I said nothing. That silence he misread as agreement, as acceptance, as the final proof that whatever line he had crossed the night before had snapped back into place behind him, invisible and forgiven. He sat down heavily, stretching his legs, claiming space. He reached for the coffee without asking, poured it himself, and took a long sip. You should have done this yesterday, he said. Might have saved us both some trouble. I watched him from across the table, my hands folded in my lap, my breathing steady. I didn't look away when his eyes flicked to my cheek, still dark with bruising. He noticed. He always noticed. He simply chose not to care. He took a bite of toast, chewed, nodded his approval. "Good," he said. "You finally learned." In his mind, the story was simple. Violence had corrected imbalance. Silence had restored order. The table set just so was proof that the old rules still applied, that fathers absorbed, sons advanced, and nothing truly changed if no one forced it to. I let him believe that. Inside, something else was happening. Something quiet, precise, and finished. I felt no anger in that moment, no urge to confront. What I felt was clarity, the kind that comes when fear has exhausted itself and left nothing behind but truth. He talked as he ate, filling the space with complaints and instructions. He outlined what he needed money for that week. He commented on the house, what needed fixing, what I should stop doing, what would make things run smoother. He spoke like a manager addressing an underperforming employee, generous with his condescension. I listened. Not the way I used to listen, with my shoulders tight and my mind racing ahead to anticipate his mood, but the way you listen when the outcome no longer depends on your response. At one point, he leaned back and studied me, his brow furrowing slightly. "You're quiet," he said. "That's good. Keep it that way." I met his gaze calmly. "I am." He smiled again, wider this time, pleased with himself. Arrogance has a way of mistaking stillness for submission. It makes people careless. It convinces them that the danger has passed. He had no idea that the danger was already seated. As he ate, my thoughts moved elsewhere, not to the night before, not to the pain in my body, but to the shape of the morning itself. To the way sunlight made ordinary things look honest. To how strange it was that this room, which had held so much tension for so long, now felt steady beneath my feet. He mistook that steadiness for fearlessness. "After this," he said, gesturing vaguely with his fork, "we're going to need to talk about some changes. Ground rules. I can't keep dealing with drama." Drama. That was the word he chose. I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that he had finished speaking. The silence that followed stretched longer than he expected. He frowned. "You hear me?" "Yes," I said. "That's all you're going to say." "For now." The smile slipped just a fraction, not enough for him to notice consciously, but enough for something in him to stir. He shifted in his chair, irritation flickering across his face before settling back into confidence. "Good," he said, standing. "I'm going to lie down. Don't forget, we need to go over the bills later." He turned toward the stairs, already dismissing me, already certain the morning had gone exactly as it should. Then the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the room cleanly, sharp as a blade. Daniel stopped mid-step and looked back at me, annoyance flashing across his face. "Who the hell is that?" he asked. I didn't answer. The bell rang again, steady and patient. Daniel scoffed. "Don't open it." I stood. The simple act of rising from my chair shifted something in the room. I felt it before I saw it, the slight tightening in his posture, the way his confidence hesitated, searching for confirmation. "Sit down," he said. I said, "Don't open it." I walked past him without meeting his eyes. Each step toward the door felt measured, deliberate. Not rushed, not heavy, just certain. Behind me, I could feel him watching, the first real note of unease threading through his irritation. "Dad," he said, sharper now. "What are you doing?" I reached the door and placed my hand on the handle. Cool. Solid. Real. For the briefest moment, I thought of how many times I had stood in that exact spot, hesitating, wondering whether opening a door, literal or otherwise, would make things worse, wondering if silence would be safer. Behind me, Daniel took a step closer. "Don't," he warned. "You're making a mistake." I turned then, finally, and looked at him fully. "This isn't a mistake," I said quietly. "It's a boundary." Confusion crossed his face quickly, followed by anger. "You don't get to decide that. I already have." I opened the door. The morning air rushed in, cool and clean, carrying with it the presence of everything Daniel had been pretending didn't exist. Authority, witness, consequence. I didn't step aside immediately. I let him see who stood there. I let the realization travel from his eyes to his posture to the sudden stillness in his hands. The smile he had worn minutes earlier was gone. Not replaced by understanding. Not yet. Just erased. As the people I had invited crossed the threshold, Daniel stood frozen behind me, the false victory of his morning collapsing into something he could no longer control. I stepped back into the room and gestured toward the table. "Please," I said, "have a seat." Justice didn't arrive loudly. It arrived the way it always does when silence finally chooses truth, calm, unavoidable, and prepared to stay. The doorbell's echo still hung in the air when they stepped inside, carrying with them a weight that made the room feel smaller and more honest all at once. The retired judge entered first, calm and deliberate, his coat still buttoned, his eyes alert in a way that suggested he'd already read the room before crossing the threshold. The police officer followed uniform, crisp posture relaxed but unmistakably official. My sister came last, her presence quiet and unyielding, like a promise kept. Daniel stood frozen near the stairs. He didn't speak. He didn't move. His gaze bounced between the faces in front of him, trying to assemble a version of reality that didn't exist anymore. The confidence he'd worn at the table moments earlier had drained from his posture, leaving him stiff and exposed. "What is this?" he demanded, finally, his voice sharp but brittle. "What's going on?" No one answered him right away. I closed the door behind them. The sound was soft, final, in a way that made my chest tighten. Not with fear, but with relief. "Please," I said, gesturing toward the kitchen. "This way." The judge inclined his head slightly and followed me in. The officer took a step behind him. My sister walked at my side, her shoulder brushing mine, grounding me in the moment. Daniel followed last, reluctantly, as if proximity alone might give him leverage. When we reached the table, the judge paused, taking in the careful arrangement of plates and cups, the untouched food, the symmetry that Daniel had mistaken for surrender. He looked at me just briefly and nodded. "This will do," he said. Daniel let out a short laugh. "You can't be serious." The officer spoke calmly. "Mr. Ward, I need you to sit down." Daniel's head snapped toward him. "You don't get to tell me what to do in my own house." I met his eyes. "Sit down." The command surprised both of us. He stared at me, searching my face for the hesitation he'd always relied on. He didn't find it. Slowly, with exaggerated defiance, he pulled out a chair and dropped into it. The judge took a seat across from him, not looming, not challenging, simply present. The officer remained standing slightly to the side, a neutral witness, with authority stitched into his posture. My sister stayed near the counter, arms folded, watching Daniel with a steadiness that made him shift in his seat. "This is unbelievable," Daniel muttered. "You drag strangers into this, you trying to embarrass me?" "No," I said. "I'm trying to end it." The judge folded his hands on the table. "Daniel, I'm here because your father asked me to be. He didn't ask me to take sides. He asked me to witness. Witness what?" Daniel snapped. The officer answered. "An allegation of domestic violence." Daniel laughed again, louder this time, but it cracked at the edges. "Domestic violence? He's not my wife." The judge's gaze sharpened. "Violence doesn't become acceptable because of bloodlines." I watched Daniel's jaw tighten, watched the instinctive anger rise, and then stall, confused by the calm that surrounded him. He was used to noise, shouting, arguing, emotional reactions he could twist and manipulate. This was different. The officer took out a small notebook. "Daniel, I'm going to ask you a few questions. I need you to answer honestly." Daniel scoffed. "You serious?" "Yes." He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Fine. Ask, did you consume alcohol last night?" Daniel hesitated, then shrugged. "Yeah. So, what, did you have a physical altercation with your father?" Daniel's eyes flicked to me. For a split second, something like calculation passed over his face. "He fell," he said. "He's clumsy." I didn't react. I didn't correct him. I let the lie hang there, unsupported. The officer looked at me. "Mr. Ward, I told him to go to bed," I said. He grabbed my arm. He shoved me. I hit the cabinet. The words sounded strange spoken aloud, not because they weren't true, but because I had carried them silently for so long. Saying them didn't make me smaller. It made the room clearer. Daniel shot to his feet. "That's not how it happened." The officer raised a hand. "Sit down." Daniel hesitated, then dropped back into his chair, breathing hard. "This is insane," he said, turning to the judge. "You're just going to believe him." "I believe patterns," the judge replied. "And I believe what I can see." His eyes flicked briefly to my bruised cheek. Daniel followed his gaze, then looked away, his confidence eroding. "You always do this," Daniel said to me, his voice climbing. "You twist things. You make yourself look weak." "I didn't make myself look anything," I said. I stopped hiding. Silence settled over the table again, heavier now. The officer spoke. "Daniel, based on what we're hearing, there are grounds to proceed. That doesn't mean anything is decided yet. But it does mean this is no longer a private matter." Daniel shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "This is a family issue. We handle this ourselves." The judge leaned forward slightly. Family issues stop being private when someone is hurt, and silence becomes the rule. Daniel looked at my sister, desperation creeping into his expression. "Aunt Ruth, come on. You know how he is. He exaggerates." She met his gaze without flinching. "I know how my brother is," she said. "And I know how you are." The room seemed to tilt. Daniel's voice dropped. "You're all against me." "No," I said. "We're all here because of what you did." He stared at me, really stared, as if seeing me for the first time. "You planned this," he said. "That breakfast. That silence." "Yes," I said. "I did." For a moment, something like fear flashed across his face. Not fear of punishment, but fear of losing control. The officer closed his notebook. "Daniel Ward, then? At this point, I'm going to need you to come with me." Daniel stood abruptly, chair scraping loudly. "No. No, you can't do this." The officer remained calm. "Turn around." Daniel looked at me, panic breaking through his anger. "Dad, tell him to stop." I didn't move. "I love you," I said quietly, "but I won't protect you from the consequences of hurting me." The officer stepped forward and guided Daniel gently, but firmly. There was no struggle, just resistance born of disbelief. When the handcuffs closed, the sound was soft, almost anticlimactic. Daniel sagged. As they led him toward the door, he twisted to look back at me. His eyes searched for something: regret, forgiveness, rescue. I gave him none of those things. What I gave him was truth. The door closed behind them, and the house fell silent again. Not the old silence. This one didn't feel like waiting. It felt like the end of something that should have ended a long time ago. The table looked larger after they took him away. Not physically, its edges hadn't moved, its surface hadn't changed, but the space around it had expanded, as if the room had finally exhaled after holding its breath for years. The plates sat untouched. The coffee had gone cold. Crumbs lay where Daniel's hands had been abandoned mid-morning, like evidence no one bothered to clear yet. I stood there longer than I realized, staring at the empty chair across from me. Ruth was the first to move. She gathered the cups without asking, her movements gentle, deliberate. The judge remained seated for a moment, hands folded, eyes lowered, as if he were giving the room the dignity of silence before speaking again. "This part," he said quietly, "is often harder than people expect." I nodded. My body felt hollowed out, like something essential had been removed and the rest of me hadn't figured out how to rearrange itself yet. The officer returned briefly to collect a few items and confirm next steps. His voice was professional, steady. He explained timelines, paperwork procedures. I listened, absorbing what I could, knowing I'd need to hear it again later, when the adrenaline wore off. When he left for good, the door closed with a soft click that echoed deeper than sound. The house belonged to me again. Ruth placed a hand on my shoulder. "Sit," she said gently. I obeyed, lowering myself into the chair I'd occupied that morning, the same place where Daniel had smiled and declared his victory. The contrast was almost dizzying. Hours ago, I'd been measuring my breathing, monitoring his mood, calculating how much silence it would take to keep the peace. Now the peace sat there on its own, uneasy but real. The judge cleared his throat. "Elias," he said, "I want you to understand something." I looked up. "What you did today wasn't revenge," he continued. "It wasn't abandonment. It was the exercise of authority you never lost. You just stopped using." I swallowed. "It doesn't feel like authority." "No," he said. "It feels like grief. And that's normal." Ruth pulled out a chair and sat beside me. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore," she said. That was when my hands began to shake. It came suddenly, without warning, as if my body had been waiting for permission to release what it had been holding back. My chest tightened. My breath caught. I leaned forward, elbows on the table, and let the tremor pass through me without fighting it. No one rushed me. No one told me to calm down. The judge waited. Ruth stayed. The room held. When I finally straightened, the shaking had eased, replaced by a heavy exhaustion that sank into my bones. "I keep thinking," I said slowly, "that I should feel something clearer. Relief, anger, even satisfaction." "And you don't," the judge said. "No," I replied. "I feel empty." He nodded. "That emptiness is where your life used to be organized around fear. It takes time to rebuild." After he left, Ruth stayed with me through the afternoon. We sat at the table and talked about small things, logistics, errands, what would need to be handled in the coming days. We didn't dwell on Daniel. We didn't speculate about outcomes. There would be time for that later. For now, it was enough to be present. As evening approached, I found myself tidying the kitchen again, this time not out of control or preparation, but instinct. I wiped the table, clearing away the remains of the morning, the symbolic debris of a chapter that had closed, whether I was ready or not. When I reached Daniel's chair, I hesitated. I remembered him as a boy, legs dangling from that same seat, swinging back and forth as he waited for dinner. I remembered his laugh, then unguarded and bright. I remembered how proud I'd been the first time he'd sat there, as a man talking about his future with confidence and hope. I didn't erase those memories, but I didn't let them rewrite the present either. That night, after Ruth went to bed, I sat alone at the table with a single cup of tea. The house was quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Not the tense quiet of avoidance, but the settled quiet of absence. I thought about the word justice. I'd always imagined it as something loud. Courtrooms, raised voices, verdicts announced with force. I'd imagined it as something that happened to other families, other men, people whose lives had already fallen apart in public ways. What I'd learned was that justice can be small. It can be domestic. It can sit down at a kitchen table and speak in measured tones. It doesn't require shouting. It requires truth. Later in bed, sleep came in waves. I woke once in the night, disoriented, my heart racing, as if expecting to hear footsteps on the stairs. When nothing followed, I lay still and let the realization sink in. No one was coming. In the morning, sunlight filtered through the curtains and landed on the floor beside my bed. I got up slowly, testing the day, the way you test an injury, carefully, attentively. My body ached in places I hadn't noticed before, bruises making themselves known now that danger had passed. I made breakfast for one. The simplicity of it surprised me. No performance, no anticipation of mood. Just food, heat, quiet. As I ate, I understood something that hadn't fully formed the day before. The table had been a courtroom, not because anyone had been sentenced there, but because the truth had been heard there without interruption. Because witnesses had been present. Because silence had been replaced by record. The verdict wasn't about punishment. It was about recognition. I finished my meal and washed the dishes, the rhythm grounding me. Outside, the town moved on cars, passing neighbors beginning their days, the world indifferent to the private reckoning that had taken place inside my walls. And for the first time, that indifference didn't feel cruel. It felt fair. I carried my cup back to the table and sat for a moment longer, letting the stillness settle into something I could live with. Justice had come and gone. What remained was responsibility to myself, to my safety, to a future that no longer depended on how quietly I could endure harm. I stood pushed in the chair and turned off the light. The courtroom was closed. And for the first time in a long while, I knew exactly why. The house didn't feel victorious after he was gone. It felt emptied, like a room after a storm where the furniture still stood, but something essential had been torn loose. I stood at the doorway, long after the patrol car disappeared down the street. The engine noise faded. The tires hissed once against wet pavement. Then there was nothing. No footsteps overhead. No muttering. No tension humming beneath every sound. Just absence. I closed the door and leaned my forehead against it, breathing slowly, until the trembling in my hands eased. Adrenaline is a strange companion. It carries you through the impossible, and then abandons you without warning, leaving you to feel every bruise it numbed along the way. The kitchen light was still on. The table remained set exactly as it had been that morning, plates aligned, cups untouched, a full pot of coffee cooling into bitterness. It looked staged now, like a photograph taken seconds before a disaster frozen in time while everything else moved on. Ruth returned to the room quietly and placed her keys on the counter. "You should sit," she said again. I did. The chair felt unfamiliar beneath me, as if I hadn't earned it yet. My legs ached. My shoulder throbbed. The bruise on my cheek burned with a dull insistence that reminded me my body was no longer pretending nothing had happened. The judge had already left, offering a firm handshake and a few final words about process and patience. He didn't linger. He understood that some moments are private, even when they've required witnesses. Ruth stayed. She poured water into a glass and slid it toward me without speaking. I drank it in slow sips, grounding myself in the simple act. I keep waiting to feel something else, I said at last. Like what relief, I said. Or guilt. Or something that tells me what this means. She nodded. It means you're human. We sat together in silence for a while, the kind that no longer felt dangerous. Outside, the town carried on. Somewhere a dog barked. A car passed. Life did what it always does, continued indifferent to personal catastrophes. Eventually, Ruth stood. "I'm going to make a few calls," she said. "Let people know you're safe." The word caught in my chest. Safe. I hadn't realized how long it had been since that word applied to my own home. After she left the room, I stood and began moving through the house. Not checking for danger, there was none but reacquainting myself with spaces that had shrunk under constant vigilance. The hallway felt wider. The living room felt lighter. Daniel's room stopped me cold. The door was ajar. I hadn't been inside since the day he moved back in. I stood there for a long moment, hand hovering over the frame, then stepped in. Nothing dramatic waited inside. Just a bed unmade. Clothes strewn across a chair, empty bottles tucked carelessly beneath the desk. The ordinary debris of a life unraveling without supervision. I didn't search. I didn't touch anything. This wasn't an investigation. It was an ending. I backed out and closed the door. By evening, exhaustion settled in, fully heavy and unavoidable. Ruth convinced me to eat something simple: soup warmed on the stove, bread, torn instead of sliced. We didn't sit at the table. We ate standing, leaning against the counter like people unsure whether the floor would hold. "I can stay tonight," she offered. I considered it, then shook my head. "I need to be alone, not lonely, just alone." She studied my face, then nodded. "Call me if you change your mind." When she left the house, exhaled again. Night fell quietly. I locked the doors, not out of fear but habit, and turned off lights one by one. When I reached my bedroom, I paused. For years, I'd slept lightly, my rest fractured by anticipation. I'd trained myself to wake at the slightest sound to calculate threats before they arrived. I wondered if my body would know how to stop now. I lay down anyway. Sleep came slowly, but when it came, it was deep. Not peaceful, my dreams were crowded and indistinct, but solid. The kind that leaves you disoriented when you wake because it's been so long since your mind allowed itself to let go. I woke before dawn to a silence so complete it startled me. No movement upstairs, no television murmuring through walls, no doors opening, closing, slamming. Just the soft rhythm of my own breath. For a moment, panic flared. Muscle memory. The old reflex of listening for danger. It took me a few seconds to remember that the danger was gone. I sat up and pressed my feet to the floor, grounding myself again. The bruise ached. My arm was stiff. I moved slowly, respecting the cost my body had paid. In the bathroom mirror, I barely recognized myself. The swelling had gone down a little, revealing sharper lines beneath. The bruise remained dark, undeniable. But my eyes were different, clearer, steadier, like someone had wiped a film away. I didn't try to hide the marks. I dressed, went to the kitchen, and made coffee. The simple routine felt ceremonial, a quiet reclaiming of time and space. As the sky lightened outside the window, I sat at the table alone. Not the head, not the foot. Just a chair chosen without thought. I replayed the moment they took him away, not with satisfaction, but with precision. The tone of his voice when he asked me to stop. The look on his face when he realized I wouldn't. That image hurt. I let it hurt. Pain I was learning didn't always mean you'd made the wrong choice. Sometimes it meant you'd finally made the honest one. Later that morning, the officer called to confirm details and next steps. His voice was respectful, procedural. He explained what would happen, what decisions I'd face, what support was available. I listened carefully and thanked him. When the call ended, I sat quietly for a long time. This was the aftermath no one talks about. Not the dramatic moment of action, but the slow recalibration afterward. The realization that consequences don't end with sirens or doors closing. They linger. They reshape. By afternoon, fatigue returned in waves. I napped briefly on the couch, waking disoriented but calmer. The house held me without tension, without expectation. That evening, I stood in the kitchen again, staring at the table. I didn't clear it. Not yet. Some things deserve to sit a while before being put away. As darkness gathered outside, I turned off the light and let the room fade into shadow. The table disappeared first, then the chairs, then the outlines of what had once been a battlefield. I stood there in the dark, listening to my own breathing, feeling the weight of the day settle into something I could carry. There was no triumph, no applause, just the quiet knowledge that I had chosen to live. And that, for now, was enough. The days that followed did not rush to comfort me. They arrived slowly, unevenly, as if time itself were learning a new rhythm inside my house. Morning light still came through the windows. The refrigerator still hummed. The clock still ticked. But the tension that had once lived beneath those sounds was gone, leaving behind a quiet that felt unfamiliar and at times unsettling. The first night alone was the hardest. I slept in short stretches, waking often, my body still braced for a door opening. A voice raised a sudden demand. Each time I woke, it took a few seconds to remember where I was and why the house felt so still. My heart would race, then slowly settle again as the truth returned. He wasn't there. By the third night, the fear had softened into something else. Not peace yet, but space. Space to breathe without listening. Space to move without permission. Space to exist without adjusting myself around another man's temper. Healing, I learned quickly, was not a straight line. Some mornings I woke up calm, even hopeful. Other mornings I felt the weight of guilt settle heavily on my chest before I'd even open my eyes. Guilt for calling for help. Guilt for not calling sooner. Guilt for being both relieved and heartbroken at the same time. I stopped arguing with those feelings. Instead, I let them sit with me the way unwanted guests do, acknowledged but not allowed to take over the house. I began making small changes. Nothing dramatic, nothing symbolic. Just practical steps that said without words that my safety mattered now. I changed the locks. I moved my bedroom furniture, placing my bed where I could see the door clearly. I adjusted my routines, so I wasn't moving through the house on autopilot anymore. Each small decision felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I hadn't realized I'd surrendered. In quieter moments, memories surfaced without warning. Daniel as a child running through the yard with scraped knees and endless energy. Daniel at 16 sulking in silence after an argument we never fully resolved. Daniel as a grown man standing in my kitchen with a look in his eyes I hadn't recognized until it was too late. I didn't push those memories away, but I also didn't let them rewrite what had happened. Love, I was learning, doesn't disappear when boundaries appear. It just changes shape. A week after his arrest, I received a message. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't angry. It was brief, typed without flourish. I'm being told I need help. I don't know what to think yet. I read it once, then again. My hands didn't shake. My chest didn't tighten. I didn't feel pulled to respond immediately. That alone told me how much had changed. I didn't answer that day, or the next. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because I finally understood that responding out of habit was another way of erasing myself. Silence, when chosen deliberately, could still be a boundary. When I did reply, it was simple. I hope you take it seriously. I'm not ready to talk yet. No explanations, no justifications, just truth. The house continued to settle into its new shape. Friends from church stopped by quietly offering meals, checking in without prying. No one asked for details. No one demanded a story. Their restraint felt like respect, and I accepted it with gratitude. One afternoon, I sat in Margaret's old chair by the window, watching dust drift through the sunlight. I realized I hadn't sat there in years. Not really. I'd passed it, circled around it, avoided the stillness it demanded. Now it felt like the safest place in the house. I thought about what it meant to be a father. For most of my life, I'd believed it meant enduring, absorbing, taking whatever came so your child didn't have to face the world alone. I had mistaken suffering for responsibility and silence for strength. What no one teaches you is that unconditional love without boundaries can turn into permission. Permission to be hurt. Permission to be erased. Permission for harm to repeat itself in different forms. I wasn't giving up on my son, but I was giving up on the version of fatherhood that required my destruction. That distinction mattered. Weeks passed. The bruise on my face faded. The ache in my shoulder eased. The deeper injuries, the ones that lived in my instincts and reactions, took longer. I still flinched at loud noises, still felt my stomach tighten when I heard footsteps outside at night. But those moments didn't own me anymore. I began to sleep through the night. I began to laugh again quietly at first, surprised by the sound when it escaped me. I began to imagine a future that didn't revolve around managing someone else's volatility. Eventually, the question of contact returned. Not from him this time, but from myself. Was forgiveness possible, necessary, safe? The answer came slowly, shaped by experience rather than hope. Forgiveness, I realized, did not mean access. It didn't mean shared meals or unlocked doors or pretending nothing had changed. It meant letting go of the need to punish myself for what I'd survived. It meant wishing him growth without sacrificing my own stability. Any future interaction would need structure, witnesses, distance, conditions that protected the life I was rebuilding. Anything less wasn't reconciliation. It was regression. One evening, I set the table for one, not ceremoniously, not as a statement, just a simple meal eaten slowly, deliberately, without tension. I noticed how my shoulders stayed relaxed, how my breathing remained steady, how the chair across from me felt neutral instead of charged. The table had stopped being a battleground. It had become furniture again. That night, as I washed the dishes, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. The man looking back at me wasn't younger. He wasn't untouched. But he was present in his own life in a way he hadn't been for a long time. Healing. I understood now didn't mean going back to who I was before. It meant moving forward as someone who knew his limits and respected them. I turned off the lights and walked through the quiet house one last time before bed. Each room felt settled, grounded, honest. For the first time since Margaret died, I felt something close to peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being fixed, but the kind that comes from knowing what will never be allowed to break you again. A year passed before I saw my son again. By then, my life no longer revolved around waiting for an apology, waiting for the next outburst, waiting for peace to be temporary. Peace had become routine, ordinary, mine. The call came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, just as the cicadas were starting their chorus outside. A case coordinator explained that Daniel had completed his mandated program: sobriety, anger management, counseling, compliance with every condition the court had set. He was requesting a mediated meeting in a neutral place with a professional present. I didn't answer right away. I thanked her and asked for time. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, the same table, though it felt like a different room now, and folded my hands. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. That surprised me. What I feared was myself, the old reflex to fix, to absorb, to excuse. So I asked myself one question and waited for an honest answer. Am I strong enough to say no again if I need to? The answer came without trembling. Yes. The meeting was set for the following week at a community center on the edge of town. I arrived early. The room was plain beige walls, a round table, 3 chairs, a window that looked out onto a parking lot. Neutral by design, safe by intention. When Daniel walked in, I recognized him and didn't. He was thinner, his shoulders less tense, his eyes clearer though tired. He looked older than his years, like someone who had finally stopped running from himself and discovered how heavy that could be. He didn't sit until the mediator invited him to. He didn't speak until he was given the floor. "I don't expect anything from you," he said. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I just needed to tell you I understand now." He paused, searching for words that wouldn't undo their meaning. "I understand that silence wasn't weakness. It was the last boundary you had left. And I crossed it. I listened without interrupting, without correcting, without softening his language. I'm learning how to sit with what I've done," he continued. "Not explain it, not blame anyone else, just carry it." There were tears, but they didn't ask for anything. They simply existed. When it was my turn, I spoke carefully, not because I was afraid, but because clarity deserved respect. "I believe you're trying," I said. "And I'm glad you are." Relief flickered across his face. But I continued, "This is where my responsibility ends." His shoulders slumped, not in protest, but in acceptance. "I forgive you," I said, "for my own sake. Not as permission, not as access. Forgiveness doesn't reopen doors. It closes wounds." He nodded. "We will not live together again," I said. We will not rebuild the past. What we can do carefully is build something new with limits that protect us both. He swallowed. I can accept that. I studied him for a moment, then added the sentence that mattered most. If you ever raise your voice to me again, this ends. Permanently. I understand, he said. And for the first time I believed him, not because of hope, but because I trusted my own strength to walk away if needed. We left separately. No embrace, no promises. Just a shared understanding of what could and could not exist. In the months that followed, our contact was minimal and deliberate. Occasional coffee in public places. Conversations that stayed grounded in the present. No rewriting history. No pretending. He stayed sober. I stayed safe. And that balance, uneven, imperfect, was enough. These days my mornings are quiet. Not the brittle quiet of fear, but the easy quiet of choice. I tend my garden. I read. I cook for myself without thinking of it as a performance or a peace offering. The table remains just a table. Sometimes when sunlight hits it just right, I remember the morning justice sat there. Not as a person, not as a punishment, but as a line finely drawn. If you're listening to this and you've been told that silence is strength only when it endures pain, I want you to hear something clearly. Silence can also be preparation. If you've stayed quiet to survive, that doesn't make you weak. It means you were waiting for the moment when speaking would finally matter. And if that moment comes, when the truth needs witnesses, when love needs boundaries, you are allowed to choose yourself. Always. Now I'd like to hear from you. What would you have done in my place? Do you believe silence can be power, or do you think it becomes dangerous if held too long? Tell me in the comments and let me know where you're listening from. If this story resonated with you, please stay with the channel. There are more stories like this ahead, stories about family resilience and the quiet strength it takes to reclaim your life. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing. It helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Until the next one.